Adolf Hitler. On the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had not seized power. He had been handed it. The president, Paul von Hindenburg, and the conservative politicians around him believed Hitler was manageable, that they could use his popularity to win votes and then control him from behind the scenes. They were catastrophically wrong. Hitler had come close to nothing in the 1928 elections. The Nazi Party won just 2.6% of the vote. But the Great Depression had arrived. Unemployment in Germany had hit 6 million, and by 1932, the Nazis were the largest single party in parliament, having won 37% of the vote. Hitler did not manufacture the crisis. He just made sure he was the only answer to it. 5 weeks after becoming chancellor, the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, burned down. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found inside, matches in hand, and arrested. Hitler moved within hours. The very next day, he had President Hindenburg sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties across the country. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly. All gone, legally, in a single signature. 4 weeks later, on March 23, 1933, less than 2 months after being appointed, Hitler pushed the Enabling Act through Parliament. It gave him the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval. Several opposition members were too afraid to attend the vote. Others had already been arrested. The act passed. Germany's democracy had voted itself out of existence. Hitler had not staged a military takeover. He had not suspended the constitution by force. He had used elections, emergency powers, and legal procedures, the tools designed to protect democracy, to dismantle it from the inside. By the time most people understood what had happened, it was already done. Within 18 months, every other political party had been banned, trade unions dissolved, the press brought under state control, and the army sworn to personal loyalty to Hitler rather than to Germany. He had gone from 2.6% of the vote to absolute dictator in 5 years, and at every step, it was technically legal. Benito Mussolini. Before Hitler, before Stalin was fully consolidated, there was Mussolini. He got there first, and what he did became the template that every fascist movement after him studied and copied. Italy in the early 1920s was a democracy in name, but a chaos in practice. The government changed almost every year. Strikes paralyzed industries. Left-wing and right-wing groups fought in the streets. The political establishment was exhausted, and the public had stopped trusting it. Into that vacuum stepped Mussolini and his black shirts. Paramilitary squads who beat up union organizers, burned down left-wing newspapers, and terrorized political opponents. The violence was the point. It was not a side effect of political passion. It was a deliberate strategy to make Italy ungovernable until Mussolini was handed control. In October 1922, Mussolini organized what became known as the March on Rome. Around 30,000 black shirts converged on the capital. The government wanted to declare a state of emergency and use the army to stop them. King Victor Emmanuel III refused to sign the order. Historians believe he feared a civil war and may have quietly preferred Mussolini to a left-wing government. On October 30th, 1922, the king appointed Mussolini as prime minister. Mussolini himself arrived in Rome by overnight train, not by marching at the head of his columns. The legendary march had been largely a theatrical performance, a show of force that worked not because the black shirts were strong enough to take the city, but because the establishment decided it wasn't worth resisting them. Once inside government, Mussolini moved methodically. He rewrote electoral laws to guarantee his party a parliamentary majority. He shut down opposition newspapers. He had political rivals arrested or killed. By 1925, he had declared himself Il Duce, the leader, and abolished all other parties. The lesson Mussolini proved was this: you do not need to be stronger than the state to take it over. You only need to make the people who run the state believe that surrendering to you is easier than fighting you. Vladimir Putin. In August 1999, Vladimir Putin was virtually unknown. He had spent his career as a mid-ranking KGB officer, then a bureaucrat in St. Petersburg city government. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's ailing and deeply unpopular president, had appointed him prime minister, the fifth person to hold the job in 18 months. Almost no one expected him to last. Then the apartment buildings started blowing up. In September 1999, 4 apartment blocks in Russian cities were destroyed by explosions while residents slept. Nearly 300 people were killed. The attacks were immediately blamed on Chechen terrorists. Putin went on television and promised to hunt the killers down, using language so raw and direct that it shocked the country. He said he would pursue the terrorists everywhere, and used a vulgarity that no Russian leader had ever used on national television. The country was gripped. Putin launched a military campaign in Chechnya. Unlike the chaotic First Chechen War under Yeltsin, This one was presented to the Russian public as a decisive, controlled operation. His approval rating went from single digits to over 50% in weeks. When Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve 1999, famously apologizing to the Russian people on live television, Putin became acting president. He won the election 3 months later. The apartment bombings have never been fully explained. Russian investigators and journalists who pursued the evidence were harassed, imprisoned, or killed. Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB agent who publicly accused Russian intelligence of staging the attacks, was assassinated in London in 2006 with a radioactive substance. A British public inquiry later concluded his murder was probably approved by Putin himself. Whether or not Putin was behind the bombings, the pattern was clear. A crisis arrived. It was catastrophic and frightening, and out of the chaos stepped a man who seemed to be the only one with the will to respond to it. That is not a coincidence unique to Russia. It is a pattern that repeats itself everywhere a strongman rises. By the time people questioned how Putin had risen so fast, he was already in control of the institutions needed to answer that question. Augusto Pinochet. On September 11, 1973, Chilean Air Force jets bombed the presidential palace in Santiago. Inside was Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of Chile and the world's first socialist leader to come to power through a free election. By the end of the day, Allende was dead. The manner of his death, whether killed or by suicide, remains disputed, though it is generally accepted today that he took his own life rather than surrender. The coup had been years in the making. Allende had won the 1970 election with 36% of the vote and immediately alarmed Washington. He nationalized Chile's copper mines, many of them American-owned, and began redistributing land. The Nixon administration, directed by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, began a covert campaign to destabilize him. The U.S. spent $8 million between 1970 and 1973 funding opposition media, supporting strikes, and making contact with Chilean military officers. Pinochet, who had been appointed commander-in-chief of the army just 3 weeks before the coup, led the military takeover. The junta moved swiftly. Thousands of Allende supporters were rounded up in the days that followed. The National Football Stadium in Santiago became a detention and torture center. Political parties were banned. Congress was dissolved. A curfew was imposed across the country. In the 17 years that followed, more than 3,000 people were killed or forcibly disappeared by the Pinochet regime, and an estimated 38,000 were tortured as political prisoners. Many were thrown from military aircraft into the ocean. Pinochet's coup demonstrated something that Chile's generals in Washington both understood. A democracy can be ended in a single morning if the military moves together and moves fast. Allende had won a legitimate election. He had the law on his side. He had none of the guns. It took 1 day to undo what voters had decided. It took 17 years to undo what the generals had decided. Idi Amin. Most dictators seize power for ideological reasons, or military ones, or to serve the ambitions of a foreign power. Idi Amin seized power in Uganda in January 1971, primarily because he was about to be arrested. Amin had served as commander of the Ugandan army under President Milton Obote. Over years in the role, he had been quietly siphoning army funds into his own accounts and using military resources to arm factions in neighboring Sudan without government authorization. By late 1970, Obote had found out. An investigation had begun. Amin's arrest was a matter of time. Obote flew to Singapore in January 1971 to attend a Commonwealth summit. The moment he left the country, Amin moved. Military units loyal to him, built up over years by recruiting specifically from his own ethnic group in Uganda's West Nile region, seized the airport, surrounded the capital Kampala with tanks, and took control of state radio. The operation took hours. By the time Obote's plane landed in Singapore, his country was gone. Within 1 week of the coup, Amin had declared himself president, commander-in-chief, chief of the army, and chief of air staff simultaneously. He suspended the constitution. The Advisory Defense Council he created consisted entirely of military officers loyal to him personally. What followed was 8 years of terror. Amin targeted ethnic groups, educated professionals, religious leaders, journalists, and anyone who had been close to Obote. Entire army units suspected of disloyalty were executed. Bodies were dumped in rivers. The Asian community, who made up much of Uganda's business class, were given 90 days to leave the country in 1972. Their property seized by the state and handed to Amin's allies. The economy collapsed within years. Estimates of the number of Ugandans killed under Amin range from 100,000 to 500,000. He was finally removed in 1979 when Tanzanian forces, responding to Amin's invasion of northern Tanzania, pushed into Uganda and toppled his government. He fled to Libya, then Saudi Arabia, where he lived in comfortable exile until his death in 2003. Amin never faced trial. He spent his last years in a luxury apartment in Jeddah. He reportedly never expressed regret. His story is a reminder that the most dangerous dictators are not always the most ideological ones. Sometimes, power is seized simply by someone who realizes that taking it is easier than the alternative. Hugo Chavez. Chavez is different from everyone else in this video. He did not seize power in a coup. He did not suspend the Constitution by emergency decree. He did not have opponents bombed or marched on a capital city. He won an election, fairly, and then he used everything the democratic system gave him to make sure he could never lose another one. In 1998, Chavez won the Venezuelan presidential election with 56% of the vote. He was genuinely popular. A former military officer who had tried to overthrow the previous government in a failed coup in 1992, then served prison time, then campaigned on fighting poverty and corruption. People loved him. The establishment had every reason to fear him. His first move was the Constitution. Within months of taking office, Chavez called a vote to form an assembly that would write a new one. The new Constitution gave the president expanded powers, the ability to dissolve parliament, to promote military officers directly, to stand for re-election indefinitely. It replaced the two-chamber Congress with a single body. It passed with 71% of the vote. Then came the courts. In 2004, Chavez packed Venezuela's Supreme Court, expanding it from 20 seats to 32, and filling the new positions with loyalists. The judges publicly declared their commitment to advancing Chavez's political agenda. The last meaningful check on presidential power was gone. State television was used to attack opponents by name. Independent broadcasters who criticized the government had their licenses revoked. Businesses whose owners backed the opposition found themselves facing tax investigations. None of this was done secretly. It was done openly, justified by the will of the people and the need to protect the revolution from its enemies. Chavez died in office in 2013. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, has continued dismantling what remained of Venezuelan democracy, presiding over an economic collapse that has driven more than 7 million Venezuelans to flee the country, one of the largest migration crises in Latin American history. What Chavez showed, and what makes him perhaps the most instructive case of all, is that you do not need tanks to end a democracy. You need elections, lawyers, and patience. You win power legitimately, then you change the rules of the game one at a time, each step justified by something that sounds reasonable, until the game itself is gone. No one moment felt like the end. That is exactly how it works. If you'd like to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.